Welcome to Elite Beyond Borders with Odai. Two dictators, two crises, two very different outcomes. History rarely answers with symmetry, so what breaks it? Today's episode begins with a simple question. Why Assad and not Lukashenko? In 2019, I decided to travel to Belarus to pursue a master's degree. At that time, nearly 8 years had passed since the outbreak of the uprising against the former Syrian regime. I left Syria while Assad was still in power and while the country was experiencing profound economic collapse and a complex internal conflict. Upon landing at Minsk airport and heading to the university dormitory, I experienced a strong sense of relief and stability after a prolonged period of pressure, particularly as I had been an opponent of the Assad regime. However, it soon felt as though instability, anxiety, and an abnormal political reality had followed me beyond Syria's borders. 7 months later, the COVID-19 pandemic began, followed by the uprising against Lukashenko and subsequently the Russian-Ukrainian war. This sequence of events was accompanied by a wave of sanctions imposed on Belarus, which disrupted air travel and severely restricted financial transactions. As a result, I was no longer able to receive external remittances, and my online work, through which I had been financing my studies, was suspended. I was eventually forced to leave Belarus in late 2022, at a time when the country was in a state of deferred confrontation, deeply entangled within a highly complex regional and international context. Now, nearly 3 years later, Assad has fled to Moscow, and Syria has entered a different political space, one open to multiple possibilities. While there are still no guarantees of a stable or prosperous future, the country has undoubtedly passed through its darkest phase. In contrast, Lukashenko remains in power, freezing political life in Belarus within the frameworks of the past and postponing a transformation long sought by the Belarusian people. A transformation whose contours and challenges this discussion seeks to examine. So to understand why these two paths diverged, we need to start with what I call the democratic gamble. Democracy and public and political freedoms constituted the broadest common denominator of the protests against both Lukashenko and Assad. However, this democratic gamble carried different meanings for each society. For the Belarusian people, the pursuit of democracy unfolded within a clearly defined context. Belarus is a dictatorship situated within a predominantly democratic environment, and political change implied a realistic possibility of integration into the European Union and the Eurozone. This trajectory had already been followed by most Eastern European states that emerged from the former Soviet Union, many of which achieved significant advances in economic prosperity as well as in public and political freedoms. Poland serves as a prominent example, having become, largely as a result of this transformation, a destination for many Belarusian young people. Yet this democratic wager faced a major obstacle that could not be overlooked: the deep entanglement of Belarus's security, military and economic structures with Russia, and the extent to which Moscow would be willing to resist any alteration of the political equation in Belarus. By contrast, Syria's democratic gamble represented a genuine leap into the unknown, particularly in light of the bloody Iraqi experience following the overthrow of the Ba'athist regime, and the transformation of the Libyan uprising against Muammar Gaddafi into an armed conflict. These precedents suggested that the trajectory of the Arab Spring would not necessarily mirror that of Eastern Europe's transition after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, there remained a lingering nostalgia for the brief democratic experiment of the mid-1950s in Syria, which was brought to an end by the Syrian-Egyptian Union, for which the suspension of political life and democratic practice in Syria had been a prerequisite. This was compounded by the insufficient entrenchment of democratic aspirations within Syrian society, the lack of broad consensus around them, or at least the absence of collective belief in democracy as a viable path for transforming reality. Despite the fact that the democratic path appeared far clearer for the Belarusian people, albeit delayed by several decades in relation to the broader European democratic trajectory, historical irony dictated that change would occur in Syria with all its profound complexities, while it stalled in Belarus despite the apparent clarity of its course. However, there is also a shared background. A global epistemic shift has taken place regarding the standing of nations in the aftermath of the Second World War, whereby individual welfare has come to be a more decisive indicator of state success than military power or political domination. Germany, for example, despite being defeated in the war and subjected to strict limitations on military production, has emerged as a model of a successful state and a preferred destination for Russian and Belarusian citizens alike, even though these societies were among those that defeated Germany during the war, particularly Russia, which itself possesses nuclear capabilities. Japan, likewise defeated in the Second World War, has similarly become a symbol of success and technological advancement. Accordingly, the notion of the strong state, especially when defined primarily in military terms and at the expense of individual well-being, has become an eroded concept, no longer sufficient to serve as a legitimate foundation for political authority, as exemplified by the regimes of Assad and Lukashenko. The power of these two regimes and their alliances has translated into little more than increased economic hardship, the protection of entrenched corruption networks, and the deepening of repressive mechanisms aimed at resisting change. As a result, the contradiction between the interests of the two societies and those of their governing systems has continued to widen. Rather than narrowing this gap, the policies pursued by both Assad and Lukashenko have, in most cases, exacerbated it, albeit with due regard for the differing intensity and specificity of each case. Yet, in the end, Assad's regime collapsed while Lukashenko's endured, despite the apparent clarity of the democratic trajectory facing the Belarusian people. This outcome can be attributed to two principal reasons, namely, the first reason lies in Belarus's delayed entry into the wave of Eastern European revolutions by nearly 3 decades, and its subsequent fixation within a geopolitical position embedded in the orbit of the Russian Federation, whereas the Syrian uprising emerged within the broader context of the Arab Spring, following the dramatic collapse of the regimes of Ben Ali in Tunisia and Mubarak in Egypt. The second reason is that Assad's system of authoritarianism was closer to the North Korean model than to the Soviet one. It functioned as a dictatorship based on the cult of the individual, characterized by total control over both state and society, and reinforced by the hereditary transfer of power from father to son. This structure sent a clear signal that any retreat from the rupture created at the moment of uprising would amount to the loss of a non-replicable opportunity for change, and that withdrawal was therefore unacceptable regardless of how arduous or violent the path might become. By contrast, Lukashenko ascended to the presidency through the 1994 presidential elections, in which he won approximately 80.3% of the vote against Vyacheslav Kabich, the sitting prime minister at the time. Thereafter, Lukashenko systematically dismantled the balance of power. He weakened parliament and the judiciary, amended the constitution in 1996 through a referendum that expanded his executive authority, consolidated control over the media and security apparatus, and later removed presidential term limits altogether. The regime thus evolved gradually into an absolute quasi-dictatorial presidential system. However, the gradual and institutional nature of this transformation preserved a persistent margin for contestation and protest, as well as the possibility of accumulation and renewal in moments of social rupture, such as the mass protests of 2020. Consequently, the suppression of any given protest movement did not foreclose the possibility of change in the medium term. This stands in sharp contrast to the earlier case of Assad's regime, where, if conditions converged to produce a moment of collective mobilization against the system, such a moment could not be reproduced once it was crushed. For this reason, the intensity of the regime and the feasibility, or lack thereof, of renewed confrontation became one of the decisive factors in determining both the continuity of the struggle and its trajectory. In any case, Lukashenko benefited from the gap left by the international community in its handling of the Assad regime. This gap began to emerge during Barack Obama's second term in 2011, following the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq. Prior to that, the international system had relied on emergency military interventions to halt episodes of mass violence, such as ending Iraq's occupation of Kuwait and intervening against Serbian forces in Bosnia in 1995. The Bosnian War concluded with the signing of the Dayton Accords in December 1995, after claiming the lives of approximately 100,000 people, including more than 8,000 Muslims in the Srebrenica massacre. Another example was the intervention that led to the collapse of Muammar Gaddafi's regime, after his forces escalated violence against civilians during the 2011 uprising. However, growing domestic pressure within the United States to end direct military interventions led to the American withdrawal from Iraq, a course that had been a core orientation of the Obama administration from the outset. This shift allowed Assad to intensify violence against the Syrian population and to carry out successive mass atrocities over several years. He was even engaged diplomatically thereafter. This sent a clear signal that escalating violence and resisting change could generate leverage rather than accountability. Unlike the case of Egypt's former president Hosni Mubarak, who responded to political change and was subsequently prosecuted, Lukashenko internalized this signal. On several occasions, he openly expressed admiration for Assad, clung to power, and suppressed mass protests with the conviction that no effective external intervention would occur to challenge his rule. This confidence was reinforced by the evident reluctance of key international actors to confront repressive policies and large-scale violence. We are thus facing a new international condition, markedly different from that of the 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century. One further consolidated by the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, which appeared as a failure and a broader retreat of Western powers from external interventions. This shift, in turn, also encouraged Putin's invasion of Ukraine. By 2024, the Assad regime had become a liability for both allies and adversaries alike. Syria had turned into a devastated country, constrained by severe sanctions, and its geography was no longer exploitable within the prevailing geopolitical configuration under Assad. This unfolded in parallel with Syria's emergence at the time as the world's largest source of Captagon, the continued outflow of refugees to Turkey, neighboring states, and Europe, as well as the rise of extremist Islamist movements in the region. These developments coincided with terrorist attacks and the rise of the right in Europe, together forming a trajectory that appeared to threaten the very foundations of democratic order on the continent. Consequently, no serious attempt was made to halt the opposition's advance during the deterrence of aggression campaign, led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, despite the surrounding controversies. This operation brought an end to the Assad dynasty and repositioned Syria within a different geopolitical alignment along the Western axis, initiating the construction of a close relationship with the United States. By contrast, no comparable interest emerged among Western states to bear the costs of policies or interventions capable of effecting change in the Lukashenko regime. In conclusion, the Syrian and Belarusian peoples, as well as proponents of the democratic model more broadly, continue to confront significant challenges amid the global rise of populism and its growing proximity to fascist values, including within established democratic systems. These challenges are further compounded by the weakening of international alignment in support of democracy, the widespread underestimation of the early stages of its erosion, and the insufficient recognition of the risks posed by alternative models that may emerge in its place. In this context, the defense of the democratic model, widely regarded as one of the most consequential achievements of modern civilization in advancing social justice, has assumed renewed urgency and heightened ethical significance. Democracy remains the only political framework that has successfully translated the principles of justice and freedom from abstract ideals into institutional form and tangible political reality. In the next episode, we will move on to discuss the issue of minorities in the Middle East and Europe, the future of major and minor ideologies throughout the rest of the 21st century, and the future of the concepts of individuality and citizenship in an era in which the forms of collective pressure on the individual are changing.